You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Hi, Stephen Halbrook. This is Brett Rappaport with the Final Say Radio Show. Welcome you to the program. And by the way, I want to congratulate you on a wonderful book here. And before we get into the book, the fact that you've done so much work with regards to the Constitution, and I'm sure you'd find it interesting what's going on in the Senate today with the Harry Reid's, I think he's made the decision to use the nuclear option to pass through some of these judge appointments.
Yeah.
And I'm surprised that he's actually gone ahead and done that, but it's interesting to me. I didn't know if you wanted to make a quick comment on that or not.
I think I'll pass on that one.
Okay. Anyway, sorry about that. Hey, Stephen, the book is called Gun Control in the Third Reich, Disarming the Jews and the Enemies of the State. I thought it was very interesting, very historical. You did an excellent job with this, by the way. And if you can, for our listeners, if you could set up the book coming out of World War I, Germany facing with the Treaty of Versailles and the nations that they fought against were putting restrictions on them. What was Germany's response, and what kind of laws did they initially set up to deal with gun control in particular?
Well, it was a pretty chaotic time, and in the streets there was fighting. It was almost a civil war. There was an attempt to make a Bolshevik-type revolution in 1919. You had pressure, internal pressure, in the midst of this armed conflict of the authorities, the Weimar Republic authorities, trying to repress these insurrections, but at the same time being overly repressive. It was basically, if you see anybody with a gun, you just shoot them on the spot. They even executed Red Cross nurses because they had guns. And at the same time, the Versailles Treaty itself was interpreted by some people to basically ban guns in Germany. So you have all of this going on with, basically, if the police wanted to say guns were banned, they were banned, and there were actually court cases going both ways on that, pro and con. We go up to like 1923, and you have another communist insurrection, and you also have Hitler's beer hall putsch, where he attempted to seize power in Munich. And so what's phenomenal about all of this is all of that calmed down, and it wasn't until 1928 that the Weimar Republic adopted a comprehensive law on firearms, and in a period of relative calm. And at that point, they were requiring licenses for possession and for acquisition of firearms. And leading up to the Great Depression starts, 1929, the economy is really going bad, and the brown shirts, the Nazis, are making gains. In 1931, at the end of the year, the Weimar Republic decreed registration of guns, not just licensing for new ones that you would get, or carry permits. So then you have a warning coming out, though, that don't let these registration records fall into the wrong hands of radical elements. And then that leads us up to 1933, when the radical elements took power and had the registration records.
Yeah, Stephen, as I was reviewing and reading the book, what I found interesting initially was the fact that, and of course you had the communist revolution in Russia, but it seemed to have a big impact in Germany, because it seemed like the Weimar Republic and then the next stages of government were trying to deal with the issue of gun control and deal with the restraints that were put upon them, but they also had to deal with the extreme, in both directions, factions, whether it be the Nazi Party and initially the communists, so it was a very difficult thing for them to maneuver through.
Right, and in the first years after the World War I ended, the communist threat was the greatest, and they were actually launching armed insurrections. They were were put down by the Social Democrat governments of that time, and there was quite a bit of bloodshed. After the failed Nazi putsch in 1923, Hitler claimed he only was going to go by legal methods, but that was by no means the internal plan. And in 1931, there was a draft, or there were these documents discovered, authored by Werner Best, who later became a top official in the Gestapo, basically saying that if there was a Nazi seizure of power, they would execute anybody who didn't turn in their guns within 24 hours, as well as deny food to Jewish people and disfavored groups. These documents were discovered, and that was one of the things that basically led to the government trying to take further measures in 1931. And one of those measures was gun registration. It seems like they would never learn, though, because the same debates that you hear today about gun control were heard then. Those who wanted to require law-abiding people to get licenses and to register didn't seem to the disconnect that law-abiding people aren't going to do anything wrong. And by the same token, those who oppose these kinds of measures made that very point that we're going after the wrong people. These are the people who register their guns are law-abiding, and they're not going to do anything. They're not communists or Nazis who are intent on violence.
Yeah, I found it fascinating, the documents that you uncovered with the actual words from individuals who were speaking on both sides of this issue back in the 20s and 30s, even making statements, well, what happens if a list falls into the wrong hands and so on and so forth. And then you fast forward to today, and we make the same arguments, and it's really incredible because what you've done here in the book is put together the framework and the model for current legislators to look at and say, yeah, this is what happens when extreme wings take over your government, and so it is possible. But if we can, Stephen, if we could now move to what was the result of what happened to the Jews and the other enemies of the so-called enemies of the German Reich as they seized power, and now they've been disarmed, for the most part disarmed.
Well, when Hitler came to power, he didn't need to make any changes on the gun laws because it was already ready-made. And he also had the emergency decree laws that enabled the executive branch basically to rule by decree and to suspend civil rights and liberties. So what the Nazis did immediately was to have all police officials go through the list of persons who had gun licenses and to cancel those people, the licenses of those people who were not politically reliable. That was the term they used. In other words, they were not supporters of National Socialism, or that's the term for Nazism. So if you were a member of the Social Democrat Party, which was one of the largest parties at that time, you would have your gun license canceled. They had canceled already all the licenses of persons alleged to be communists, but it wasn't just leftist parties. It was also the centrist parties and those who were more moderate, and basically anybody who was a potential political enemy. So at that time, in 1933, the Nazis were mostly disarming political enemies. They did carry out some search and seizure operations, though, in Jewish communities in Berlin. It's just that they didn't go against the Jews to the same extent as they did later at that point. And if you go through the next 5 years, however, up to 1938, that's when the anti-Jewish programs were going full steam, and you have the attempt basically to confiscate their economic wealth. And as a way to do that and to ratchet up all these other measures, by October of 1938, the Nazis were canceling the gun registrations and licenses of Jews in Berlin and throughout Germany, and basically having them turn in their guns. They did that because they had the registration records. Some Jews went to the police stations and turned them in voluntarily. Others were basically caught in search and seizure operations. And all of that led up to, in November of 1938, the Night of the Broken Glass, 75 years ago this month, or Kristallnacht as it sometimes is called. And they wanted an incident. They found a tragedy that they didn't want to go to waste. There was a young Jewish teenager from Poland, non-German, who went into the German embassy in Paris and shot one of the members of the staff who died in a couple of days. And that was the excuse. They said all Jews are dangerous, no matter from what country they're from. And that's what led to this onslaught where Jewish homes were broken into, shops were destroyed, windows broken, synagogues were burned, all of that in November 1938 under the guise of Jews with guns are a danger to public safety. And they arrested 20,000 Jewish men and put them in concentration camps. And when questioned what was the basis of that, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels gave a press conference to the international press saying that they were in possession of guns. And that's now illegal because Himmler had just decreed, SS head Heinrich Himmler had just decreed any Jew caught with a gun would get 20 years in a concentration camp. And that's pretty phenomenal if you think about it. That was 1938. Had the war not come, you can imagine 1958 would have been the year that these people would have been released. Well, as a matter of fact, most of them, or at least a lot of them, did not possess guns. They were just taken in under pretext, and then they were forced to pay money to get out of the concentration camp. So it was just, and then the whole Jewish community was made to pay for all the damage that these Nazi hooligans had done.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely right. I want to read from your book, because I found this very interesting. I think it fits right in here, that so many Jews were veterans of World War I who possessed firearms or edged weapons, as you write here. A lot of them maybe came back with souvenirs or whatnot from the war. But more than 100,000 of the 550,000 Jews in Germany had served for Germany during the Great War. 12,000 were killed in action, and more than 30,000 have won decorations. And then the Austrian-Hungarian Empire had 300,000 Jews who had served, 24 of them ranking as generals. So when you put those facts, the contributions, of course we're on the other side, but the contributions that they gave to the country, and now they're being vilified for the fact that I suppose they're just Jewish. It's really incredible.
It is, and if you read that period, the Nazis were claiming that the Jews, all of them, were part of some kind of Bolshevist, Marxist revolution, which was totally incredibly stupid and false. German Jews were highly integrated into the German society. There were numerous officers during the war. They served honorably. In fact, they couldn't believe what was going on around them when, during the Kristallnacht period, they were taken into custody. And I have a whole chapter of the book, basically, of statements made in diaries and in recollections by people who lived then, Jewish people who these things happened to. And a large number of them were they were very conservative, politically oriented. They were in no way communists. Many of them were not even socialists. And they basically couldn't believe what was going on before their eyes. And in fact, this whole episode was authorized by Hitler, orchestrated by Goebbels, and they basically unleashed the brown shirts, the dregs, the SA people, on the Jewish population. And the German people, according to international press reports, were horrified as to what was going on. The German police were told they cannot intervene, and they were very much angered by this kind of vandalism that was going on. Unfortunately, they became instruments as time went by to this repression, but it was like a total onslaught of vandalism and death, and it just, people were shocked. The Jewish people and the so-called Aryan people, many of them, couldn't believe what was going on in that society.
Yeah, it had to be really an incredible thing to live through. Now, Stephen, after having done all this research and finding all these really incredible documents, how do you feel today, as we've seen for years now, a push for so many, not just by the federal government, but so many states have, for instance, I live in New Jersey, we had something like 30 or 32 different bills that were introduced last year and put onto Governor Christie's desk. And to me, we already have way too much gun regulations in the state, and I feel like our constitutional rights are already being violated. But what do you feel is going on here in the United States?
Well, let me preface what I say by the following. Book is about the history. I mentioned current things in the introduction, but the entire book is basically about the history. It's a legitimate subject. It's been completely ignored by historians, and some people act like it never happened. We have Holocaust deniers still in this society, not many, but then there are proponents of gun control in our own society pretend like this never happened. And one message I want to get across very clear, I'm not accusing them of being Nazis, and I'm not saying we're anything like Nazi Germany. We have a free press. We have the right to keep and bear arms. It's pretty much respected in most states. We can vote for people. You didn't have any of those under National Socialism. We're more like in the Weimar Republic as far as our gun laws, these either existing laws or proposed laws that are set forth with a lot of naiveness, I think, is the right word, because, once again, they're trying to solve violence, but directing the laws against their own people. But what I do think is entirely proper is this whole subject matter. It's like it's been a void, a complete void historically. Historians have not touched it. And I don't know why, and I don't want to speculate why, but it's an important part of history. History doesn't always repeat itself. It does sometimes, and we have to be aware of it and aware of what can go wrong.
Well, Stephen, I think what's very important to recognize is history does often repeat itself. But it sounds like what you're basically doing is providing us with the guidelines to recognize the stages that would, at minimum, be conducive to tyranny and totalitarian regimes coming to power where we do not have a defense. Now, with that said, have you found friends in the political spectrum who've been reaching out to you based upon the history to then try to make comparative analysis to what's going on today to try to prevent us from creating a conducive environment like we did in the 30s?
Well, one reaction is the following. New Republic New Republic Magazine online did a review of the book, but they didn't mention anything much about the book. It was just about the introduction, and they basically said, well, here we go again. Somebody's comparing today with Nazism, and we know how this gets exaggerated. And it does get exaggerated. People use that term too loosely when they describe people they disagree with today, right? But then not to say anything about the merits of the history in the book or the fact that this history occurred. People like to argue, well, it wouldn't have made any difference had the Jews not been disarmed or the other political opponents. But the Nazis certainly thought it was extremely important to disarm these people before they either simply restricted their activities or put them in concentration camps or deported them. It's always important to disarm those who you want to oppress, and that's exactly what they did. There were instances during the war in which Jews took up arms, and the most prominent example is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1942, where they held the Nazis off for a number of weeks, and they stopped the deportations that were going on. These are all important things to remember. Had there been 2, 3, or many Warsaw Ghetto Uprisings, that would have saved lives. And if you want to talk about the relevance of this today, this seems somewhat unbelievable, but when the Heller case was in the U.S. Supreme Court, you had, on the one hand, Jews for Preservation of Gun Ownership filing an amicus brief, basically arguing that we've got to look at these historical lessons. But then you had some, what I would describe as pacifist Christian and Jewish organizations filing a brief saying that, well, the only thing wrong with what the Nazi policy was is that they only disarmed Jews. They didn't disarm everybody. And so what do you think could be a better society if only the German police and the Gestapo and the military force was armed? Because that's what advocates of that viewpoint see as the ideal of disarmed citizenry.
That's an excellent point. You know, having read the majority of your book, I'll admit I didn't read every last part of it, but I read a good part of it. I thought that there are certainly so many things that you cover that haven't been discussed, aren't discussed, So you've covered this greatly. You've introduced some very interesting historical facts, and so I commend you on a great job, and it was very enjoyable, and I'd certainly recommend it. The name of the book, folks, is Gun Control in the Third Reich by Stephen Halbrook. Stephen, I know you're with the Independent Institute. Would you like to plug any of the other things that you're working on?
Well, the Independent Institute supports liberty causes, basically, or scholarship, and they've published another one of my books on the Second Amendment, and they published free market economy type material, free speech, civil liberties, things like that. And basically what I've been trying to cover in my career is how universal is this right to keep and bear arms, and how important it is to be recognized along with other basic human rights for a lot of reasons. But if you look through history, I mean, we got our independence because of this right, and because the British attempted to deprive the colonists of the right to keep and bear arms as a way to impose their other oppressions. I cover that in my book called The Founder's Second Amendment. And when you lead up to our early history, we know that slaves were disarmed. There was a reason for that. And that's a book of mine that was reprinted by the Independent Institute called Securing Civil Rights, how the 14th Amendment to the Constitution was intended to do away with these state laws that were disarming freed slaves and African Americans right after the Civil War. So you can see a lot of historical parallels here. My latest book, Gun Control in the Third Reich, has some of the same lessons. You've got, on the one hand, those in authority trying to disarm those persons in society, either the majority or some sector of them who they disagree with and they want to exploit. So it's basically a lesson of history. I mean, you go back to ancient Greece and Rome, and you'll see the same phenomenon.
That's excellent. So where could people get a copy of this book? Could they order it from the Independent Institute, or
You can go to independent.org, or you can just go to Amazon, or
Amazon?
It's all over the place. Now, getting books is so easy now. It's incredible. And
sure it is.
Just Google my name, Stephen Halbrook, Halbrook, Gun Control in the Third Reich, and you'll find it.
Okay. Stephen, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and again, I congratulate you on the book. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. I think that very important, very deep researched information, and again, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on the show, Brad. I appreciate it. Take care.
Okay. You're welcome. Take care. Mm-hmm. Again, folks, this is Stephen Halbrook, and the book is entitled Gun Control in the Third Reich, Disarming the Jews and the Enemies of the State.